I had never seen it coming. I had been loyal. Loyal to the company. Loyal to Greg, my boss. 25 years of sacrifice, of putting the company above my own life, of skipping family vacations, working weekends, and being the first one to arrive and the last one to leave. I lived and breathed that place. I believed in its mission, in its future. I believed in Greg's promises. Promises that I had followed blindly, hoping that he would appreciate me in the end. After all, the sacrifices were supposed to mean something. They were supposed to be a down payment on security, on respect, on the job that would carry me into retirement with dignity. But that morning, as I sat in the glass-walled conference room with the sunlight bouncing off the sleek steel buildings outside, I was betrayed in a way that left my body numb. "Gary, we've decided to move in a new direction," Greg said. His voice as smooth as it always was, but now it had a clinical detachment to it. He never looked me in the eyes. The man who once claimed we were family was now telling me I was being let go. After 25 years of grinding, climbing the corporate ladder, and proving myself day after day, I was being tossed out like yesterday's trash. I blinked, processing the words, trying to make sense of them. My throat tightened. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Betrayal is a silent thing, a suffocating thing, and it fills you with confusion before it lets the pain seep in. "You're kidding, right?" I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse. I was still numb, still grasping at the unreality of the moment. This couldn't be happening. Greg leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't before: indifference. There was no empathy in his eyes, no regret. Just cold, calculated efficiency. "We're restructuring, Gary. You've had a good run, but we're looking at the future now." "Restructuring?" The words tumbled from my lips, but they didn't seem to matter. I didn't need to say anything. Greg had already made up his mind. He had his own reasons. He'd already made his plans, and I was just a casualty of those plans. I should have known something was off. There had been whispers, little things, but I had always brushed them aside. A cut in bonuses, a slowdown in the budget, the promotions that never came, the projects that were suddenly handed to younger, less experienced employees. I told myself it was just a phase, a rough patch. But now, sitting there, I realized that everything had been a lie. And then came the gut punch. "Also, we've come to terms with a severance package for you," Greg continued, as if discussing some minor inconvenience. "You'll get a few months' pay, a retirement package, health insurance for a while, and of course we'll help you transition. We're here for you." Here for me? The man who had just pulled the rug out from under me? The man who had obliterated a quarter of my life? There was no here for me. There was no transition. There was just the cold truth of it. The company had no room for me anymore. But what struck me the most wasn't the severance, the empty words. No, it was the fact that Greg wasn't even a little bit sorry. He wasn't even vaguely uncomfortable. He had come to this decision months ago, and all I was to him now was a line item to be crossed off. I stared at him, trying to read the man who had once been my mentor. There was nothing there. He had become someone else, someone I didn't recognize. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. As I left that conference room, my footsteps echoed in the hollow hallway, and I felt the weight of 25 years pressing down on me. My life, my whole existence, had just been erased. It was as if I had never mattered at all. I didn't feel anger at first. I just felt numb. The shock, the disbelief, the gut-wrenching feeling of betrayal, they all tangled together in my chest, making it hard to breathe. But as the hours wore on, the anger began to take root. It wasn't just the company that had betrayed me. No, it was Greg too. Greg, who I had thought of as a friend, a mentor, a man I had trusted. He didn't deserve my trust. He didn't deserve my loyalty. The hours after that meeting were a blur. I went home and sat on the couch, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I had been discarded, replaced. For what? Was I too old? Was I too slow? Was I too much of a risk? Was I just too much of a reminder of the company's past when we used to believe in something? I didn't know, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Greg had taken something from me. He had destroyed my life, and he would pay for that. He had no idea what he had just done. I was still trying to understand the depth of my hurt, but it was already transforming into something else. Something darker. Something cold. I didn't want a severance. I didn't want their help. I wanted something else. Something more. I wanted justice. I wanted revenge. The seed was planted, and there was no going back. It's strange how quickly something shifts inside you. One minute you're walking through your life, convinced of your purpose, your place in the world, and then someone rips that foundation out from under you. The next thing you know, you're a different person entirely. I didn't recognize myself anymore. Not in the reflection in the mirror, nor in the thoughts racing through my mind. I spent the first few days in a haze trying to process it all. I told myself I would stay calm, that I would move on. That's what they kept telling me, right? Get a new job. Don't burn bridges. This is just a bump in the road. But there was a part of me that could barely contain the rage brewing inside. The hurt had transformed into a deep, gnawing need for retribution. And if I didn't act on it, it would swallow me whole. Greg thought I was just some old corporate guy, someone who would pack up his things, shuffle out, and fade quietly into the background. But he didn't know who he was messing with. He didn't know the monster he had just awakened. First, I didn't know where to begin. I thought about going to HR, maybe fighting the decision, but the reality settled in quickly. I was a casualty of their agenda, an old relic in the way of their shiny new direction. No one cared about me anymore. No one would listen to my complaints, and even if they did, I knew how this game was played. Greg was too powerful, too well-connected. My complaints would disappear into the same corporate machinery that had spit me out. So I decided to play his game. On my terms. The first thing I did was watch. I sat back just like Greg had done to me. I became an observer, and I began taking stock of everything. His life, his business, the people he surrounded himself with. What did he care about? What did he fear? It wasn't hard to figure out. Greg's empire was built on image, reputation, status, appearances. He didn't just want to be successful. He wanted to be seen as successful. He wanted everyone to think he was untouchable. The man lived for accolades, for awards, for recognition from others. That's where I would strike. I started small, gathering information. I had a good relationship with the office staff before all this went down, and they were more than willing to talk. People are always willing to talk when they think you're no longer a threat. I learned about the backroom deals, the shady investments Greg had made, and the lies he had told to secure his standing in the community. His perfect life, a house of cards built on lies. I also made sure to keep track of his personal life. Greg's reputation wasn't just tied to the company. It was tied to his image as a family man. His perfect wife, his beautiful kids. Everything about them was designed to make him look like the ideal leader, the ideal husband, the ideal father. But everyone has secrets, right? Everyone has skeletons buried deep in their closet. Greg's were no exception. The more I dug, the more I realized that everything Greg had built was a facade. His success wasn't earned. It was manipulated. It wasn't that Greg was a genius. He was a charmer, a manipulator. I was just one of the many people he had used and discarded over the years. But I wasn't going to be his last. I wasn't interested in taking everything from him. No, I had more refined tastes. I wanted his reputation. I wanted him to feel the humiliation that I had felt, to experience the same crushing realization that I was no longer important, no longer relevant. Next came the strategy. It wasn't going to be quick or reckless. Revenge isn't a fleeting burst of emotion. It's a slow burn, a delicate, methodical process. And Greg was going to be the perfect example of that. I started by feeding subtle information to the press. Nothing that could immediately blow up in his face, but enough to make him nervous. A small leak here, a quiet whisper there. His business dealings, his questionable ethics, his lavish lifestyle that didn't quite match his income. It would all start to trickle out, slowly, insidiously. No one would know exactly who was behind it, but he would start to feel the walls closing in. It would start with little rumors, whispers behind closed doors, questions from journalists who were just doing their jobs. But it would snowball, and soon enough, it would become a full-blown scandal. Then there was his personal life. His perfect family, his proud public persona. It all hinged on his wife, Marissa. A woman who, by all appearances, was as supportive and devoted as they come. I had learned some things in my time at the company, though. Things about Marissa's spending habits, her extracurricular activities. They weren't just rumors. I had the receipts. I hadn't planned to go that far. I didn't think I would have to, but in the end, if I was going to destroy him, I had to take everything from him. And that meant exposing the cracks in his perfect life. That meant forcing him to face the truth, no matter how ugly. As I sat in my apartment that night, alone, scrolling through the information I had gathered, I felt something stir inside me. An odd mix of power and emptiness. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was coming next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stop. Not now. Greg had taken my life, and now it was my turn to take his. Piece by piece, I would bring it all crashing down. The first step in my plan was always going to be the hardest. The moment when you go from just imagining revenge to actually taking action. There's a shift when you stop fantasizing about the perfect payback and start moving toward the reality of it. The adrenaline is different. It's colder, sharper. It's the feeling of putting the pieces of a puzzle together that you've spent so long studying, knowing exactly where each part fits. This was no longer about raw emotion. This was about precision, about control. I started with the press like I had planned. It wasn't immediate, but over the course of a few weeks, the stories began to trickle out. A low-level article here about questionable practices in Greg's business dealings. A brief mention of his extravagant lifestyle, which didn't quite match his public persona. I fed it slowly, methodically, until it gained enough traction to make people start asking questions. Greg's position, once unassailable, was beginning to crack. The power I felt as I watched the first article surface was intoxicating. I wanted to smile, but I didn't. I didn't want to give myself away. But deep down, I could feel something inside me, something darker and more dangerous, satisfied. Greg had built this perfect life, this pristine image, and now it was starting to unravel, piece by piece. The next step was a little more delicate. I had to plant the seeds of doubt in Marissa's mind. She had been the loyal wife, the adoring mother, the perfect accessory to Greg's image. But just like the company, her perfect life was a carefully constructed lie. I made sure Marissa got the information I needed her to. It wasn't a direct confrontation. I didn't have to meet her face to face. I didn't have to say a word. I just left breadcrumbs, little things that would make her question what she thought she knew about her husband. I didn't need to expose everything at once. I didn't need to send her into a full-blown meltdown. No, I just needed her to start looking at Greg with suspicion, to begin peeling back the layers of the illusion he had created. I knew that would be enough. I didn't want to break her. I wanted her to turn on him, slowly, quietly. When that happened, Greg would have no place to hide. The cracks in his perfect image would grow into a fissure. And from there, I would make sure everything collapsed. But it wasn't just his family I was after. Greg had to feel the consequences of his betrayal in the deepest parts of his life. So I continued feeding small, subtle leaks to the press, each one more damning than the last. I had gathered information on his finances, on his shady business ventures that were never disclosed to the board. And with that, I slowly planted stories that made people question his integrity. Soon, his empire would crumble, not from one massive scandal, but from a slow, systematic dismantling of everything he had built. I didn't do it for the satisfaction of seeing him lose money or status. I didn't even do it because I wanted him to feel the same kind of hopelessness I had felt when he fired me. No, what I wanted, what I needed, was for Greg to feel the same deep-rooted humiliation I had felt. For him to realize that, no matter how high he had climbed, I could bring him down. The pleasure of watching him squirm was almost enough to make me forget how much I had lost. Almost. But as I carried out each step, I began to notice something. Part of me was starting to feel empty. The satisfaction, at first so sharp and bright, began to fade into something more hollow. There was no real joy in this. No true victory. What I had thought would fill the emptiness inside of me only seemed to create more of it. Every time Greg's perfect life started to crack, A piece of my humanity felt like it was slipping away. It wasn't the justice I had imagined. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't cathartic. It was just a void. The first real breakthrough came when the press picked up a larger, more detailed story. I had managed to leak a financial report that linked Greg to some illegal offshore accounts, the kind of thing that could ruin any corporate executive. At first, it was dismissed as a conspiracy, but as the story gained traction, the pressure started mounting. Greg was under investigation. He began losing business partners. The board members started distancing themselves. People began to talk. And then Marissa did something I hadn't expected. She confronted Greg. I didn't know how or when, but I knew it would happen. It had to. She found out about his affairs, about the lies he'd been feeding her for years. That was the final straw. Her perfect image of him shattered, and in her rage, she turned on him. Her betrayal of him was more cutting than any of the others. I watched it happen, but I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel happy. I just watched, detached, as Greg's life came crashing down around him. The empire he'd built, gone. The family he had manipulated, destroyed. I didn't need to be there to see his face when it all came crashing down. I didn't need the satisfaction of confronting him. I didn't need to hear him beg for mercy, because I already knew what was coming. Greg was going to lose everything. And when he did, he would feel the same thing I had felt. The same emptiness, the same sense of being nothing, of being discarded. But as his world began to unravel, something else started to creep into my mind. The doubt, the fear. Was this really what I wanted? What had I achieved? Yes, Greg had been exposed for the fraud he was, and yes, I had taken back some small measure of justice, but what did that make me? The man who was out for revenge, who tore apart someone's life because his own had been ruined. Was I really any different from him? As the days wore on, I started to question myself more and more. The truth was, the more I watched Greg's fall from grace, the more I realized how hollow revenge really was. It had given me temporary satisfaction, but at what cost? Would I ever be able to feel whole again? The weeks after Greg's downfall were both exhilarating and suffocating. I had accomplished what I set out to do. He had lost everything, his company, his family, his reputation. The whispers in the media grew louder with every passing day, feeding the public's insatiable need for scandal. But the worst part wasn't the constant press coverage. It was the cold realization that none of it made me feel better. At first, there was a brief moment where I thought I'd feel something: victory, triumph, satisfaction. It was everything I had imagined when I was stuck in that conference room, staring at Greg as he unceremoniously fired me, wiping his hands of me like I was nothing. But here I was, the architect of his destruction, watching the pieces fall into place. And yet, there was no satisfaction. The emptiness had only deepened. The media kept coming, asking me for my side of the story, but I refused to speak. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't want any part of their narrative. They didn't care about the reasons behind what I did. They only cared about the drama, the chaos. It was the same with everyone who tried to talk to me. Friends, former colleagues, people I had once trusted, begged me to talk. But I knew better now. They were just hungry for the spectacle of it, a world hungry for others' misery. Still, as I watched Greg's public life collapse, his assets frozen, his reputation ruined, his family torn apart, I felt something unexpected: guilt. It wasn't the kind of guilt that made me wish I could undo it all. No, I wasn't that naive. I had seen the consequences coming from a mile away. I knew what I was doing, and I had no illusions about the destruction I was causing. But the guilt came in waves, small, insidious reminders that I, too, had lost something in all of this. I had sunk so deeply into my own darkness that I couldn't remember who I was before all of this. I didn't recognize myself anymore. My identity had been so entangled with the idea of revenge that I had forgotten how to feel whole without it. The worst part of all this? My isolation. The deeper Greg fell, the more I found myself retreating into the shadows. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't reach out. Couldn't. I had alienated myself from the very world I once belonged to. All those people I had been close to, those colleagues I had worked side by side with for years, they had either abandoned me or distanced themselves. It wasn't just the media I was avoiding. It was the world itself. I kept busy, though. I filled my days with small, monotonous tasks to keep the chaos at bay. I went through the motions, waking up, eating, working, anything to avoid confronting the deeper questions gnawing at me. What now? Was this the life I had been working toward? A life built on destruction and loss? I didn't have answers. And the worst part was that, deep down, I knew I didn't want to face the truth. I thought revenge would be sweet. I thought it would fill that void left behind by Greg's betrayal. But now that I had seen it through, all I had was an empty shell of satisfaction that quickly faded into regret. The fallout was inevitable, but it wasn't just Greg who suffered the consequences. His family, Marissa and the kids, they were left in the rubble of a life destroyed. I couldn't help but feel responsible for their suffering. I had never meant for them to be collateral damage, but in this game, that's what happened. I had focused so much on Greg's destruction that I hadn't taken the time to consider the broader consequences. The children, those innocent bystanders, had no place in this. They didn't deserve this. But then there was the moment when Greg reached out to me, the first time he had ever tried to contact me since that fateful day. His message was simple. I know you're behind it all. Why? What do you want from me? Everything's gone. It's over. Why did you do this? I didn't respond, but I sat there for hours, staring at the screen, weighing my options. I thought about all the times I had tried to reason with him, all the ways I had convinced myself that if I just did the right thing, if I just gave him my loyalty, it would all pay off in the end. Instead, it had led me to this point. A man I had trusted, a man I had worked with for over 2 decades, was now begging me for mercy, and I had no mercy to give. The worst part wasn't his desperation, though. It was mine. The longer I let the message sit there unanswered, the more I realized that I wasn't just hurting him. I was still punishing myself. The truth settled in as I thought about what had become of me. I had spent so long running toward revenge, toward satisfaction, that I had forgotten about everything else. I had forgotten about the person I was before Greg's betrayal. I had forgotten who I was underneath all the pain and anger. Greg's fall was supposed to be the closure I needed. But in the end, it only left me more broken than ever. And as I sat there, watching his crumbling empire and feeling the weight of my own actions, one thing became painfully clear. There was no victory in this. There was no joy. There was no triumph. There was only the quiet, hollow realization that revenge was nothing but a fleeting fix. And now I was left with the consequences. What had I really gained? I had taken everything from Greg, but I had lost myself in the process. I had become the thing I hated, the person who destroyed another life just to feel powerful, just to feel something. And I knew, deep down, that no matter what happened to Greg now, I would never get that part of me back. I had destroyed Greg's life, but in the process I had destroyed my own. And now I was left to face the aftermath. The silence, the guilt, the emptiness. Time has a way of distorting the clarity of your decisions. The edges soften, the details blur, but it doesn't erase the consequences. They linger, like a stain on your soul that refuses to wash away. I didn't hear from Greg again after that message. The silence stretched on, and I began to realize that I wasn't just avoiding him. I was avoiding myself. I had wanted closure, but what I had gotten was a void so deep it threatened to swallow me whole. I kept thinking that maybe, if I had seen Greg suffer more, if I had caught one final glimpse of his brokenness, it would have been worth it. But that final satisfaction never came. It never did. Instead, I woke up every day with the same gnawing sense of emptiness. I wasn't just alone. I was haunted by my own actions. I could still hear Greg's voice, still see his face when he sent me that message, his desperation and brokenness palpable even through the screen. I had driven him to that point, and somehow that was worse than anything he had ever done to me. I had become the villain in a story that I had written for myself. Days turned into weeks. I tried to keep busy, but it didn't work. The people who had once known me, the ones who had called me a friend, kept their distance. It wasn't just Greg's life that had shattered. My relationships, too, had cracked under the weight of my revenge. I couldn't look at anyone without wondering if they knew what I had done, if they could see the rot inside me. The The distance between us grew wider every day. I had isolated myself, and in doing so, I had removed the last thread of connection to the world I had once known. I tried to focus on rebuilding, but I couldn't shake the image of Greg's life crumbling. I had watched it all unfold from a distance. His wealth evaporating, his family falling apart, his company losing clients, his friends abandoning him. But instead of feeling the thrill of justice, I was left with a profound sense of loss. I had turned someone into a casualty of my anger and ambition. And as I thought about it more, I realized something. I wasn't any better than the man I had hated. I had become what I despised. The more I reflected, the more I understood the cost of my actions. Revenge, I had thought, would be sweet. I had believed that once Greg paid for what he had done, once he was stripped of everything, I would feel whole again. But instead, I had destroyed myself along with him. What had I really achieved? Greg's empire was gone, but my soul had been lost in the process. I had spent so long plotting and executing my revenge that I had never stopped to consider what it would do to me. And now, I couldn't escape the ghost of who I had become. The feeling of being untouchable, of being in control, had been intoxicating at first. But as the days stretched on, it became clear. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone else broken. Not really. Because when you break someone else, you break yourself too. I had learned the hard way that justice, when it's served through vengeance, never feels like justice at all. It only feels like an empty echo, a hollow victory that you can never fully grasp. And then there was the question that gnawed at me in the quiet moments of my life. Was this what I had wanted? What had I hoped to achieve when I first set this plan into motion? Had I thought that revenge would heal me? That it would fix everything? I didn't have answers. I had nothing but the stark, brutal realization that I had let my pain and anger define me. I had let them dictate my actions. And in the process, I had lost myself. Time kept moving forward, but I didn't. I had become trapped in the aftermath of my own choices. Greg was gone from my life. His reputation shattered, his family broken, his company a shell of what it once was. But I had never truly left. I was still tied to that moment, still tethered to the dark satisfaction I had felt when I saw him fall. But it didn't feel like victory anymore. It felt like an endless cycle. A cycle of anger, betrayal, and guilt. I had thought that I could right the wrongs of my life by bringing Greg down. But now I saw that revenge was never the solution. It was a path to nowhere. I had wanted to feel whole again. But now I felt more fractured than ever. I had wanted to take back my power, but in the end, I had only surrendered it. The price of revenge was too steep. It had cost me more than I had ever expected, and it had taken from me something I could never get back. The journey I had taken, one fueled by rage and betrayal, had led me to a place I never imagined. There was no closure, no redemption, no justice. There was only the haunting realization that revenge, while it may promise to right the wrongs done to you, only deepens the wound. I had learned that the hard way. The man I had become wasn't just the one who had destroyed Greg's life. The man I had become was someone who had destroyed his own. And I knew, with a clarity that had taken me far too long to reach, that there was no way back. What had I really gained? Nothing. Just the quiet, painful echo of a life ruined by my own hand. And now all I could do was live with it,